Hi, Brian D. Anderson here. Some of you may know me. For those of you who don't, I'm an author of high epic fantasy. I was an indie for 9 years. I wrote The Godling Chronicles, Dragonvein, The Veil, and co-authored with Stephen Saville, Akiri. Most recently, I was picked up by Tor Books, the fantasy arm of Macmillan. And with them, I have released The Bard's Blade. It came out January 28th. Book 2, of course, of Fire, will be coming out August 4th. Now, instead of hearing me fumble and bumble through this book, I thought, being that I happen to have the files, might enjoy hearing a professional read. So, you get to enjoy Mr. Andrew Kingston read one of the chapters of The Bard's Blade. And if you do pick up the audiobook, you'll also get to hear Miss Tamsin Kennard. This is a dual narrated book, and they both do a fantastic job. So, I hope you enjoy it, and I'll catch you at the end.
Chapter 7. The Zara Trap. The deadliest blow is not dealt with a cry of fury, but with a smile and a song. Book of Kylor, Chapter 36, verse 12. After that first night, Lem's reputation and popularity grew. Soon he found himself playing to a full house almost every night, storm or no storm. People throughout Harvest Grove were talking about the young master at the Oak and Amber, who played music equal to what could be heard at any royal palace. And when he walked the streets, he was universally greeted with smiles and compliments. For obvious reasons, Zara was well pleased with the arrangement. The only other tavern in town, the Bull and Quail, was now virtually empty most evenings. Such was the establishment's decline that its desperate proprietor had even ventured into the Oak and Amber a few times in an attempt to lure Lem away. On each occasion he was quickly and roughly thrown out before he could utter more than a few words. It was the only task involving Lem that Durst seemed to actually enjoy, and Lem was well aware that the barman would far rather it be he on the receiving end of his violence. He had tried to make peace with the barman, even helping him clean the bar on a few occasions. But his efforts were futile. If anything, they seemed to fuel the man's animosity. Not that it mattered. Durst worked for Zara, and Zara would not allow Lem to be touched, at least not by Durst. She had persisted with her advances, offering him a place in her bed where, as she put it, she could look after him properly. It was an offer he invariably declined, explaining that he was betrothed and that his fiancée awaited his return. It was uncertain if she believed him, but to his relief, she never pressed things beyond casual flirting and innuendos. As it was, even though the reason he gave for his reluctance was a lie, the betrothal having been broken the moment he left home, his heart did still genuinely belong to Mariah. They could never be together, yet the idea of loving another was unimaginable. Not while his soul felt so empty. Perhaps never. Although Lem had done his best to gather as much information as he could about this new world, he found that most people had little interest in life beyond their own front doors. Without pressing the issue, and thereby exposing a difficult-to-explain degree of ignorance, he found that even after speaking to dozens of the townsfolk, he still knew very little. Not to say he'd learned nothing. From his conversations with Martha, he now understood that Archbishop Rupardo Trudeau V was head of the Church of Kylor in Ralmarstad. The king, Zolomy, controlled the government, but only with the consent and support of the archbishop. He still hadn't entirely puzzled out the strange relationship between the church and the king. But it appeared to him that it was the archbishop who held the true reins of power, his position ordained by their god, Kylor, about whom he still knew very little. Lem thought this form of hierarchy quite strange indeed. Vailari was governed by a council of elders, each town independent of the other. When decisions for everyone had to be made, a special group was appointed. Aside from that, few laws were needed. A single person ruling over the whole of Vailari was a laughable prospect. No one would tolerate it. But here, it was accepted as normal. He'd also teased out of her that while the Order of the Thaumas was not exactly forbidden in Ralmarstad, they refused to bow to church authority, which in turn set them at odds with the king. The Order was quite powerful in its own right, having mastered most of the known magics, and they'd aligned themselves with every powerful nation beyond Ralmarstad borders. Lem now realized why asking questions about them was dangerous. He'd be viewed as a heretic, there to stir up trouble, and heretics were not tolerated. Eventually, he became resigned to the fact that to learn more would mean leaving Harvest Grove. But that presented a difficulty. One thing he had quickly discovered was the need for gold. To leave, he needed a whole lot more than he currently possessed. Zara gave him a few coins here and there to purchase basic necessities, but beyond that, his entire wealth amounted to what little he'd had upon his arrival. 2 Vailarian copper coins and a silver, which would be recognized as foreign at once, so were of no use. Another setback for his plan to move on was learning that the city of Lobin, the nearest major hub in Ralmarstad, was a 2-week journey by foot. Though he could make it in half that time on horseback, there was no chance he would think about mounting one of those beasts. He'd tried to calculate how much gold he would need to set him on his way, but it was impossible to account for things of which he had no knowledge. From the few conversations he'd overheard, Lobin was an expensive place to live. At least in Harvest Grove he had food and shelter, so, for the time being, he was forced to stay put. Regardless of how many people came to listen to him play each night, Zara always made a point of complaining about how little gold she was making. If she were to be believed, the tavern was on the verge of shutting down. Not that Lem did believe her. Though inexperienced in the ways of Lemuria, he'd had more than enough experience with dishonest people. It was one thing it had in common with Vailari. Only 4 months prior, he had to threaten the mayor of Oleon Springs with being brought before the council for refusing full payment after a performance in his home. And Mariah was constantly chasing down those who would attempt to avoid paying for a wine shipment. Zara did not want Lem knowing how much he was increasing her wealth, and it was no mystery as to why. A few patrons would toss him a spare copper now and again, but that was the limit. As much as he needed more, Lem could not hold it against them. They had nothing extra to give. What little coin they earned was spent on day-to-day survival. Well, that and ale. Unless he intended on staying here permanently, he would need to find a way to earn more. He was at present playing for a room and meals. That had to change. It had been acceptable when there was nowhere else to turn, but that was no longer the case. If nothing else, there was always the Bull and Quails offer. While he was grateful for Zara's help, fair was fair. She was sitting at her desk, reading through some papers, when he finally screwed up enough courage to speak to her on the matter. "Zara, I want you to know how grateful I am for all you've done for me," he began, trying his best to not allow his anxiety to bleed into his tone. She leaned back in her chair, expressionless as she tossed a paper onto the pile. "But—" Lem took a courage-building breath. "But, if I'm to continue playing here, I need to be paid in coin as well as room and board." He was about to launch into a well-rehearsed explanation of his merits and why his request was reasonable, but Zara's hand slamming on the desktop cut him short. I take you in. I give you food and shelter. I protect you from Durst. He'd have beaten you to death by now, you know. And you still want more?" Her face had turned crimson in an instant, and her typically calm and measured voice was now piercing. Lem had never seen her angry, certainly not to this degree. There had been a time or two when a patron got a bit too drunk, or when Durst would irritate her, but nothing like this. The look in her eyes chilled his blood. He wanted to retreat, to ask her to forget he mentioned it, but he knew that he couldn't. He had to find a way to leave. With nothing of value to sell, aside from his Balasari and his locket, neither of which he was willing to part with, this was the only way. He was finding it impossible to speak in the face of Zara's wrath. Yet, he did not leave. "Are you going to say something?" she demanded. "Or just stand there wasting my time?" Lem shoved his hands into his pockets to hide that they were shaking. "You can do this," he repeated in his mind, until, in his calmest tone, he said, "I'm not ungrateful. I really do appreciate what you've done for me. All the same, I think I deserve at least something. The tavern is filled practically every night, and I don't even have a few coppers to buy myself a new pair of boots. I'm not asking for much, just enough to take care of my own needs." She shot from her chair, knuckles pressed to the desk. "You think I'm rich? You think just because we have bigger crowds that I'm awash with gold? You know how much ale I have to buy just to keep these sorry sods happy? How much food? Every drop they drink, I have to buy more. And it's not like I can raise my prices. Oh, no. The second I do that, they're off to the Bull and Quail. If you imagine you can sing them into staying, you've lost your mind. You're good, but you're not that good." Had he retreated when first she raised her voice, the obvious attempt at intimidation and misdirection might have worked. But remaining firm and speaking out had bolstered his resolve. He detested confrontation, preferring to work out differences calmly and rationally. Shemi was the outspoken one in the family. But it was clear that to get what he wanted, he would have to stand his ground. What's more, her blatant lies and selfish greed were stirring his anger. All the same, he knew he needed to be cautious. Zara was not prone to succumbing to pressure. Not to mention that at a snap of her fingers, Durst would be only too delighted for an opportunity to pound his head to a bloody pulp. He considered his next words carefully. "The owner of the Bull and Quail said he'd give me 4 silvers a night." Instead of another angry outburst, an expression of calm came over her, and the room fell ominously quiet. Reaching into the desk drawer, she removed a small dagger. For a dreadful moment, Lem thought he had miscalculated. Fatally so. A wicked smile eased its way up from the far corners of her lips. "Is that right?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. 4 silvers a night. Is that what he offered? And I suppose you expect me to do better, yes?" Lem could not look away from the blade. He didn't really think she would use it, not unless he actually said he was leaving. Stay calm, he told himself. She's just trying to scare you. It was working, too. He held up his palms. "I didn't say I was going to take it, but I am one of the reasons so many people are coming. Surely a few coins isn't asking too much." Slowly, she sank back down into her seat, and for a long, nail-biting moment said nothing. Then her practiced, welcoming expression was restored. Very deliberately, she returned the dagger to the drawer Of course, you're right. You deserve something for all your hard work. I've been unfair to think otherwise. But 4 silvers is more than I can afford, and I promise you, that thief at the Bull and Quail has no intention of paying that much either. The minute you arrived, he'd go back on his word. So, here's what I'll do. 1 silver a night when we're busy, and 10 coppers on other nights. 10 coppers? It took 40 to make 1 silver, and 40 silvers for 1 gold. It was well short of what he'd been hoping for. On the other hand, she was probably right in saying that the proprietor of the Bull and Quail would have changed the deal once Lem had committed himself. He was quickly learning that people in Lemuria often did not keep their word. Not that his own people were completely honest either. But a contract, even a verbal one, could be brought before the council if broken. Here, there seemed to be no consequences for dishonest dealing. Though Zara's sudden change in tenor was sounding off warnings, he bowed his head. Thank you. You are too kind. Yes, I am. She returned to her papers. Now, shouldn't you be getting ready? There's a storm coming tonight. You know what that means. On the way out, just before closing the door, he caught a glimpse of Zara shooting him a dark look. He knew that he had stepped onto the precipice, but it was too late to turn back now. Zara was a woman who needed to control everything around her, and she was accustomed to getting her own way. Durst would do whatever she said without question, as would everyone else who worked for her, apart from possibly Martha. Even the few townsfolk who did not frequent the taverns knew better than to cross her. Yet what else could he have done? He needed to be paid. Perhaps in time she might have thrown him a few extra coppers, but that could have been months from now, or maybe never. The real danger, he considered, was that she likely suspected his desire to leave Harvest Grove. Remembering the look on her face and the sound of her voice, he had serious doubts that she would just sit by and watch as he walked away. She might offer him more coin to stay, but then she might choose to do something more drastic. As expected, the rain brought in the crowd. The fall storms, he'd learned, were common in this region and could last for several days, though naturally, Zara didn't mind this one bit. And according to Martha, the winter snows had much the same effect on business. Of course, since you arrived, it's twice as busy as it used to be, she'd told him during one of their now customary suppers together in the kitchen. In truth, it was their conversations as much as anything else that had prompted his confrontation with Zara. Martha was fearless, with a strong sense of right and wrong. He would most assuredly miss her when he left. She had become his first real friend here, and the only reason he was not completely disgusted by Lemuria. As he stared out over the common room, a sense of hopelessness closed in. When he had first arrived, the oak and amber had seemed like a haven, and Zara his salvation. Now it was the exact opposite. It had become a prison, and she his jailer. But he needed to keep moving forward. The vision the stranger had shown him burned always in the back of his mind. He required information, and to get it, he couldn't spend every day and night in some dilapidated tavern at the edge of nowhere. The dirt-covered faces he saw pouring cheap ale into their swollen bellies simply fed an urge to just grab his belongings and run out into the storm and never look back. Was there somewhere in this world that didn't reek of stale spirits, unwashed bodies and urine? One could grow accustomed to most odours, or at least after a time find them tolerable, but this foul stench wasn't among them. While strumming out the first song, he noticed Durst looking over at him. The man was smiling, genuinely smiling. Never before had he regarded Lem with anything but undisguised contempt. An uneasy feeling rose in the pit of his stomach. This can't be good. As the night wore on, so his sense of foreboding continued to increase, in part due to Durst's persistent smug looks in his direction. Had his hands not been so practiced, he would have made mistakes from sheer distraction. He was preoccupied enough not to notice a new face among the patrons until well into the night. The man was sitting alone at a table just off to Lem's right, near a support beam. Dressed in a deep blue jacket with gold buttons, he had wavy, shoulder-length black hair, and his fingers sported several gold rings. His features were different from those of most of the townsfolk. Angular jaw, with an aquiline nose and narrow blue eyes, and his complexion was much darker than most. When Lem did finally notice him, the newcomer smiled and raised his mug, giving him an approving nod. Strangers in the tavern were not entirely uncommon, but the wealth displayed set him well apart from the dust-covered travellers Lem had seen previously. Lem nodded in return, wondering if perhaps his gratuities for the evening might amount to more than the usual copper or two and a few drunken words of admiration. Zara emerged from the crowd, but rather than coming over to Lem, she sat down with the newcomer. The two of them began chatting, although it was clear that the man was more interested in listening to Lem than speaking to Zara. By the time the last note was played, the tavern was still mostly full. Over the course of the evening, Zara had come and gone from the stranger's table several times. Lem could not help but notice that although the man always held a mug in his hand, he didn't appear to drink. Lem couldn't blame him. He had tried the ale once and very nearly emptied his stomach. Normally, Lem made a point of returning to his room immediately after a performance. If he did not, he was sure to be goaded into one final song that invariably turned into 5 or 6 more. He preferred to be alone, anyway. This time, however, the man at the table waved him over. Lem considered ignoring the invitation. He was quite tired, but the prospect of extra coin compelled him. "You have quite a talent," the man said, gesturing to the seat opposite. "Thank you," Lem replied, giving a slight bow. "My name is Farley, and you are Lem, correct? Or did that scamp Zara tell me wrong?" "No, that's my name." "That woman. I'm surprised she didn't have that oaf of a bartender throw me out." Lem creased his brow. "Why would she do that?" "Because I'm definitely not the kind of person she would want around someone like you." "What do you mean?" Leaning back in his chair, Farley clasped his hands behind his head. A broad smile splashed across his face. Even his bearing, with a level of confidence and ease unlike the customary slump-backed despondency exhibited by the locals, was unusual. "You really are about as naive as they come, aren't you? Zara is making a fortune off you. The last thing she wants is for someone to snatch you away." "And you are such a person?" Lem asked, just a hint of skepticism showing through. Farley raised an eyebrow. "Maybe you're not quite as naive as I thought. It's good to doubt. People are liars." "So I've learned." Lem caught sight of Zara talking to a group of patrons. She had not yet noticed that he was sitting with Farley. Durst, however, had noticed, and was watching them intently. "What can you offer me?" "Straight to the point. I like that." Farley leaned forward, elbows on the table. "I own a small travelling theatre troupe. I would like for you to come and work for me." "As what?" "As a musician, of course. What else? I have musicians in my employ, but no one with your talent. You see, people's tastes have changed over the past few years. They don't want long productions. The trend is for short skits, and we can manage 3 per night. But the intermissions are killing my business. I need someone who can keep the crowd entertained while we prepare the next play." And from what I heard tonight, I think you're perfect for the job." Lem noticed that Durst had left the bar and was now whispering into Zara's ear. "How much will you pay me?" "More than Zara, I can assure you." At that moment, she looked over, her face contorted with anger. "How much?" he pressed. 5 silvers per night." Before Lem could respond, Zara arrived at their table, wearing a tight-lipped smile. Now, Farley," she said, taking a chair and moving it protectively close to Lem. "You wouldn't by any chance be trying to steal away my prized musician, would you?" "Of course not," he replied with a disarming smile. "You know me better than that. I was just curious about how he had come to be in this out-of-the-way little town of yours." "Oh, I know you quite well," she responded. "Lem here is what you might call a foundling. He would be lost without me. Isn't that right, Lem?" "Of course," he replied, then rose from his chair. "If you will excuse me, it's been a long night." Zara took his hand, gripping it a bit too firmly. "Yes, do that. A young man needs his rest." "It was a pleasure to meet you," Lem said, bowing to Farley. "The pleasure was mine," he replied. "I'll be in town for another day or two. Perhaps I'll see you again." "I would like that," said Lem. "Very much." Pulling free of Zara's hold, he threaded his way quickly through the crowd and back to his room. He felt a powerful urge to leave there and then, but that would likely cause a major commotion. Something to be avoided, if at all possible. No, he would wait until morning. Zara was not an early riser. Neither was Durst. He regretted not finding out where Farley was staying, but a man like that should be easy enough to find. Quickly packing his few belongings, he wrapped up his balasari and placed everything in readiness in the corner. His heart was pounding with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Dimming the lantern, he stripped off his clothes and slipped under the blanket. "You should just pick up your things and walk right out," he told himself. "She has no right to keep you here." But the truth was, when Farley had mentioned "this little town of yours" to Zara, he was more accurate than he knew. This was her town, at least in the sense that she was as powerful a person as one could find here. Should she decide to kill him, there would be no one willing to stop her, nor would anyone dare to challenge her motives. He would be dead, and nothing would happen to her as a result. Not a single consequence or modicum of justice. Another lesson he had learned shortly after his arrival. A merchant, overserved with whiskey, had made the grievous error of placing his hand on Zara's backside without invitation. At the time, she had appeared only mildly annoyed, but no one saw the man again, and his cart was found abandoned just outside of town. Rumors spread that Zara had watched while Durst chopped off the man's fingers one by one, allowing him to bleed until he was nearly dead before slitting his throat. Lem had been unsure as to the veracity of the story, though Durst had made an offhanded comment a few days later that should Lem step out of line, he would add 10 more fingers to his growing collection. It took about an hour before he was able to quiet his mind enough to begin drifting off. The dawn could not come soon enough. Even if Farley were not being honest about the pay he offered, which was a distinct possibility, it was still a way out of Harvest Grove. He started to wonder what life would be like amongst a travelling troupe of actors. A small group of his friends used to put on plays around Vailari each spring, and occasionally he would tag along with them for a week or so. Those had been quite enjoyable days, even though he was a terrible actor himself. He'd rarely taken part in anything on stage, content instead to simply watch their productions and help behind the scenes. This new adventure, he imagined, would be entirely different. He would now have the chance to really see and learn about his new world. Then, with a bit of luck, he could locate the thalamus and help prevent the image he'd seen of burning lands and dying friends from becoming a reality. The prospect was sufficient to banish any fear he had of Zara's wrath. A firm knock at the door startled him awake. A second, much louder thud had him sitting bolt upright, throwing off his blanket. Who in blazes could be at his door at this hour? Durst's harsh voice gave him his answer. "You want your pay or not?" he shouted, banging hard enough to shake loose bits of wood from the doorframe. Lem stumbled to the door and cracked it open. Durst was smiling again, setting off renewed warning signals. He thought to push it shut, but a thick, powerful arm shot out, shoving the door fully open and throwing Lem several paces back. "I've been waiting for this." Durst grinned, his massive hands clenched into fists. Lem had no time to react. The first blow sent him flying over the bed and crashing into the far wall. Great waves of pain shot through his skull. For a moment, he was completely blind. He could feel the floorboards shake as Durst rounded the bed. He tried to scramble to his feet, but another blow to the center of his back forced him down again. Initially, he thought his back was broken. Only the realization that he could still move his legs told him otherwise. "You're lucky," Durst snarled. Flipping Lem over, he gripped a handful of his hair. "I wanted to kill you, but Zara said no." Lem was helpless as another punch thudded into his cheek, then yet another to his eye. And still they kept coming, blow after blow, each accompanied by a loud grunt of satisfaction. How many times Durst pummeled him before he finally lost consciousness was impossible to tell. The last thing Lem remembered was the taste of blood filling his mouth and the sound of heavy breathing before the mercy of unconsciousness took him.
And there it is. I appreciate you listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Now, before I go, I just want to say I want everybody to stay safe, stay indoors, social distance, listen to the experts, follow the guidelines they set out. We will come out of the other side of this. I promise you. Now, in the meantime, there are a lot of great books to take your mind off the stress and fears that we're all feeling each day. Hopefully you'll choose one of mine. If not, there are a lot of great authors out there. Anyway, thanks again. This is Brian D. Anderson signing off.